This is the first time Prasanna is defending his thesis. So he's expecting some words from you as the chair of the panel.
Okay. Hi. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, I think today
And
we are going to have this.
if you don't mind,
oral
just be
defense.
visible for a few minutes. Is it okay? Or your camera is not working or something like that?
Yeah, sure. I'm driving, but it's
Yeah.
okay. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Since everyone's here, so good morning, everyone. So today we are going to have this oral defense from Prasanna. And the topic is implementation attacks on post-quantum lattice-based cryptography. So I think since everyone is here, so let's get Prasanna started. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. William. So hello, everyone. Welcome to my PhD dissertation defense, which is on the topic of implementation attacks on post-quantum lattice-based cryptography. So this PhD dissertation was done under the supervision of Dr. Anupam Chattopadhyay and Dr. Shivam Basing. So this is going to be the outline of my talk. So first, I'll be trying to provide motivation for the two research areas, which is post-quantum cryptography and side channel attacks and fault attacks. And further, I'll be talking about my research contributions, followed by conclusion. So first I'll start by motivating what's post-quantum cryptography. So whenever you want to establish security and trust between two untrusted parties, we rely on public key cryptography. In fact, public key cryptography lies in the foundation of security in the internet and is a key enabler of several applications such as net banking, online gaming, e-commerce, and whatnot. So let's say we have Alice and Bob who don't trust each other. So before Alice wants to securely communicate with Bob, she can use digital signatures to verify the identity of Bob. And further, Alice and Bob can run a key exchange scheme to exchange a shared secret in order to become trusted parties. So digital signature schemes and key exchange schemes are two prominent public key cryptographic primitives that we commonly use today in the internet. So in our current systems, we realize PKC using the RSA and ECC crypto system. The security of RSA is governed by the hard prime factorization problem, and the security of ECC is governed by the discrete logarithm problem. And to this day, there does not exist an efficient algorithm that can solve these problems in polynomial time on classical computers. So life for cryptographers was good until a monster arrived in the form of a research paper in 1994, where Peter Shor reported the first quantum algorithm that can solve the discrete logarithm problem in polynomial time. So what this means is that if an attacker has access to a large enough quantum computer, he can easily break the RSA or ECC crypto system. So just to give you an idea, these are numbers taken from a consensus report published in 2019, which shows that an quantum attacker with a few million qubits can break concrete instances of RSA and ECC in just a few hours. So we know that computing giants like IBM, Intel, and Google, who are in the race towards building the first large-scale quantum computer, and we see rapid advances being made where quantum computers are growing in capacity as well as computational power. In fact, the Cloud Security Alliance, an independent working group, is running a timer towards years to quantum, which is defined as the day when a quantum computer will be able to break the public key crypto we use today. And there are different estimates between 7 and 15 years. So all in all, the fact of the matter is that the quantum computing threat is real. So this has motivated the cryptography community towards building alternate public key crypto that is resistant to attacks from quantum computers. And this is referred to as post-quantum cryptography. So post-quantum cryptography is basically built upon, is cryptography built upon hard problems that are conjectured to be hard for both classical as well as quantum computers. And it's important to clarify that post-quantum cryptography does not require quantum hardware and can run on our classical devices. So while the research on post-quantum crypto started way back in 1996, the first real push towards PQC for practical applications happened in 2016 when NIST issued a call for proposals for standardization of PQC. So different research groups from academia as well as industry submitted about 69 proposals. And this process started in about 2017 and spanned over 5 years. And it was in July 2022 when the first PQC standards were announced. So the first standards for PQC are expected to be drafted in about 2024, which will initiate wide-scale adoption of PQC. And we'll roughly have about 15 years for the transition before large-scale quantum computers become a reality in late 2030s. So my PhD journey lies bang in the middle of the NIST PQC standardization process, and it does give me a very nice opportunity to make a meaningful and lasting contribution to the NIST PQC standards. So in the NIST PQC process, there were several categories of post-quantum cryptographic schemes based on different hard problems in mathematics. So lattice-based crypto is based on hard problems on geometric structures called lattices. And you have hash-based crypto, which is based on the hardness of inverting one-way hash functions. And you have code-based crypto, which is based on the hardness of decoding random error correcting codes. And among the different categories of post-quantum crypto, lattice-based cryptographic schemes were the majority category that were selected, as they provided a very nice balance between both security and efficiency. And they were also immediately usable for practical applications. So my PhD research also solely focused on lattice-based schemes. Thus, it seems like we placed our bets on the right horses when it comes to our choice of which PQC schemes to study. So there are two broad categories of lattice-based schemes, those based on the learning with the error and learning with the rounding problem, and those based on the n-true problem. And we have schemes that are standardized both based on the learning with the error and rounding problem as well as the n-true problem. So hopefully in a post-quantum future, we will have strong post-quantum crypto to counter the threat of quantum computers. So with respect to the NIST PQC process, the candidates were selected based on different selection criteria, with the primary criterion being the theoretical post-quantum security. And then came the implementation performance on different hardware and software platforms. Another important criterion was basically resistance of PQC implementations towards side channel attacks and fault attacks. And this is particularly relevant when you want to implement post-quantum cryptography on embedded devices. So NIST has also explicitly stated the importance of side channel attacks and fault attacks in several areas throughout the NIST PQC standardization process. And in fact, I have personally provided 2 invited seminars to NIST on side channel attacks and fault attacks on lattice-based crypto, which includes works that were undertaken as part of my PhD research. So a natural question that comes is, we talk about resistance against big quantum computers. So what are these side channel and fault attacks that we're talking about? Which basically brings me to the background on side channel attacks and fault attacks. So if you look at theoretical security proofs that govern cryptographic algorithms, they are only valid under a big assumption. And this assumption is that the crypto system is a black box that cannot be tampered. So what this means is that the attacker cannot know anything apart from the output of the crypto system, and that the attacker cannot tamper the operation of the crypto system towards producing faulty outputs. But the question is whether these two assumptions are really true in practice. And the answer is a big fat no, because this ideal black box crypto system does not exist, because any cryptographic algorithm or crypto system is ultimately implemented on a practical electronic device where physical leakage in the form of power consumption or electromagnetic radiation can be used to obtain information about the intermediate state of the device, which can reveal secret information. So this basically invalidates the black box assumption, and the attacks which exploit this are known as side channel attacks. So similarly, an attacker can also inject errors in the cryptographic algorithm through different means, such as glitching the voltage and clock lines, by injecting lasers on top of chips, and also by injecting high voltage electromagnetic pulses. So the faulty outputs that come out as a result can be used to reveal information about the secret key. And these attacks that exploit this vector is known as fault injection attacks. Thus, the attacker basically sees what the crypto system did there and is able to recover secret information. So the more realistic model for cryptanalysis is where we assume the presence of a variety of side channels through which attacker gets additional information to perform practical attacks. So these attacks are actually particularly relevant for embedded systems, which are used in a wide variety of different applications. So these embedded devices are typically deployed in remote locations where an attacker can get easy physical access to the device. Thus, if you want to implement post-quantum crypto on embedded devices, this makes post-quantum crypto naturally susceptible to side channel attacks and fault attacks. So just to give you a bit of a picture, this is the picture of our electromagnetic emanation side channel setup, where we are running a post-quantum cryptographic algorithm on a microcontroller. And what an attacker can do is the attacker can mount a near-field EM probe on top of the chip and can measure the switching activity of the chip to perform practical attacks. And similarly, what an attacker can also do is to inject high voltage electromagnetic pulses on top of the chip. And this has the effect of inducing additional currents within the device, which induces errors in the computation. So As you can see, my research basically lies in the intersection of two topics. One is post-quantum cryptography and one is side channel and fault attacks. So when I started my research, these were the questions that were basically facing me. Firstly, if you want to understand the threat of side channel and fault attacks on lattice-based crypto, we first need to identify the different types of attacks that are possible in the first place. Only then you can think about protecting them. And we also have implementation attacks on RSA and ECC. So the question is, when compared to RSA and ECC, which are the pre-quantum crypto systems, how vulnerable they are compared to the lattice-based crypto systems. Now, are there any inherent algorithmic properties in these lattice-based crypto systems that makes them vulnerable to side channel and fault attacks? And can side channel and fault attacks be used as a distinguishing factor between similar lattice-based schemes? And this question was very relevant during the NIST PQC process. And the final question is, if you want to protect against side channel and fault attacks, what type of countermeasures you have to deploy, and what are the overheads that these countermeasures incur? So the research contributions. So now I'll jump to the research contributions. Now, the research contributions which I'll be covering in this talk can be broadly categorized into two parts. So firstly, we'll talk about side channel attacks, and then we'll talk about fault attacks. So let's start with side channel attacks, where we present the idea of side channel assisted chosen ciphertext attacks on lattice-based chems. So let me give a brief background on what are chems. So chems are basically primitives used to establish shared secret between two untrusted parties. So here you have Alice, who runs the key generation procedure to generate a public key and secret key. Bob then uses Alice's public key to encapsulate the message and generate a ciphertext and the corresponding session key. And Alice then uses her secret key to decapsulate the ciphertext and arrive at the same shared session key. This decapsulation cannot be done without the knowledge of the secret key. And chems in general operate in two modes. So firstly, you have the ephemeral mode and the static mode. So ephemeral mode is where new key pairs are generated for every session key exchange. And static mode is where a single key pair is used to perform multiple key exchanges. So we focus on static key modes. Why? Because Alice manipulates the same secret key multiple times. And this basically gives more opportunity for a physical attacker to perform practical attacks. So here the main target is Alice's decapsulation procedure that manipulates the secret key. So any attacker who wants to attack this crypto system can ask this simple question as to what is the easiest and simplest attack that's possible on lattice-based schemes. So as a primary contribution, we propose the concept of side channel assisted chosen ciphertext attacks for lattice-based schemes. And the main idea is to basically query the decapsulation procedure with malicious or handcrafted inputs. And this basically has the ability to amplify the side channel leakage of the secret key. So our side channel assisted chosen ciphertext attacks that we propose have several advantages and features. So firstly, they exploit algorithmic properties of the target scheme. And in most cases, they do not require any knowledge of the design or implementation, which is a very important advantage. And the attack is agnostic to the implementation and can be adapted to both hardware and software. So this arguably makes it the easiest side channel attack possible on lattice-based schemes. And these attacks apply in a very generic manner to multiple lattice-based schemes and are also capable of breaking side channel countermeasures as well. So what this basically shows is that in a chosen input setting, the side channel attacker has increased capabilities. So we'll first start with the first work, which targets lattice-based schemes based on the learning with the error and learning with the rounding problem. So the main target is the decapsulation procedure, which starts by decrypting the ciphertext to get the message. Now, if this message is directly exposed, it's prone to chosen ciphertext attacks. So what is done is that this message is re-encrypted and then compared to check if the received ciphertext is actually valid or not. And this framework is actually referred to as the Fujisaki-Okamoto transform. And this framework is actually theoretically secure against chosen ciphertext attacks because it detects invalid ciphertext with a very high probability and rejects it. And it only generates a valid session key for valid ciphertext. So this has the capability of distinguishing between valid ciphertext and invalid ciphertext with a very high probability. So if you look at prior attacks that were done before our work, all the attacks were done assuming that you can only probe with valid ciphertexts, where secret key leakage is only observed in decryption and not anywhere else. because if you see the message is basically independent of the secret key. So there is no leakage of the secret key from the effort transform. However, what we show is that an attacker can intelligently craft ciphertext such that the decrypted message is actually related to a part of the secret key. And because of this, all the operations that manipulate this message also become sensitive. And the use of the crafted ciphertext ensure that the effort transform is also vulnerable to side channel leakage of the secret key. Thus, an attacker who can exploit this leakage can realize what we refer to as a plaintext taking oracle for chosen ciphertexts. And if the attacker can do this for multiple chosen ciphertexts, then he can fully recover the secret key. So essentially, it's like a lie detector test where you're probing the device with questions, and you're basically trying to find answers and the real truth. So let's look at how this attack is done in LW and LWR-based schemes. So LW and LWR-based schemes typically uses polynomials, matrices, and vectors. So what we showed in our work is that you can construct a malicious ciphertext in order to restrict the decrypted message to just two possible values. Typically, the message is 256 bits, but you can drastically reduce the entropy to just two values. And the value of the message basically depends on a part of the secret key. So if you look at the re-encryption operation, the first operation is the hash function. So because the message is passed to a hash function in the effort transform, side channel leakage from all operations henceforth will actually be very different when you compare m equal to 0 versus m equal to 1. So this difference in leakage is very drastic and can be detected easily through power or EM in order to realize a binary plaintext taking oracle, because essentially the attacker is trying to get single bit of information about the secret key in every query. What such an attacker can do is such an attacker can collect leakage for multiple chosen ciphertexts and can try to classify whether the traces corresponds to m equal to 0 or 1. And then he can run an offline analysis to recover the full key. So I would like to argue that this is the easiest side channel attack possible because leakage from about 60 to 70% of operations in the device can be used to realize an oracle. And because there are so many leakage points to exploit, the attack does not require a very sophisticated setup. And we'll also see that the attacker does not require any knowledge about the implementation, and it purely exploits algorithmic features. So these are some experimental results from our work. Here we see that the attack is capable of recovering the full key across multiple schemes in a matter of few minutes and in a few thousand traces. So the number of traces to attack Kyber, which is the NIST PQC standard, was further brought down in our subsequent work to just 1,300 traces, while the original work required about 7,700 traces. And this particular attack is applicable to 6 lattice-based schemes in the NIST PQC process. So I would like to argue that this particular work had a lot of impact on side channel attacks on post-quantum crypto, because this work initiated a large body of literature on side channel assisted chosen ciphertext attacks, and it also demonstrated the need to protect the entire decapsulation procedure against side channel attacks and not just the decryption procedure. And one notable impact of this work is that it triggered several follow-up works that attempted to achieve CCA security without the effort transform, as the effort transform serves as the primary source of leakage. So while side channel attacks are usually dealt with at an implementation level, it is remarkable to see that side channel attacks also can affect algorithm designers to tweak their algorithm for side channel attack resistance. So there were also several follow-up works that tried to make these attacks more efficient on lattice-based schemes, as well as trying to port them to different post-quantum crypto, not just lattice-based crypto, but other type of post-quantum cryptography as well. So on to some few observations on the binary plaintext taking oracle attack. So if you look at this attack, the attacker is essentially recovering one bit of information about the secret key. And thus, in order to recover the full secret key, you require a few thousand traces. So the question is, can we make this attack more efficient by recovering more than one bit of information? So this brings us to the second contribution, where we instantiate a full decryption oracle using side channels on LW and LWR-based schemes. So in this work, we basically show that chosen ciphertext can be constructed such that the decrypted message contains 256 bits of information about the secret key. So I'm not going to go into details of how this can be done, but more details are basically present in this work. So now, because the message contains 256 bits of information about the secret key, the attacker now needs to recover the 256 bits of information. So if an attacker can recover the entire message, he basically instantiates a full decryption oracle and he can reduce the number of queries to perform full key recovery by a factor of 256. But now the question remains that is there an operation in the decapsulation procedure which we can target to recover 256 bits of information about the decrypted message? So now if we observe how LW and LWR-based schemes work, we see that they involve computation over matrices, polynomials, or vectors, depending on the type of scheme. So if you look at encryption, the message is typically a bit vector. So in order to do computations on polynomials, you basically encode it into a polynomial, and then you pass it to the encryption core. Similarly, in decryption, you basically derive a message polynomial, and then you basically decode it back to the message bit vector. So these encoding and decoding operations basically are done one bit at a time. And the question is that there is this inherent property of bitwise manipulation in lattice-based schemes, and whether this bitwise manipulation can be exploited through side channel leakage. So here we visualize the decoding procedure where single polynomial coefficients are decoded to bits. So you have different message polynomial coefficients, and you are trying to decode the different coefficients to bits. So what we see is that because the bits are manipulated one at a time, leakage from both the computation as well as the storage of the decrypted message bits can be exploited. And when we do leakage evaluation, we clearly see leakage due to the individual bits, which are shown as separate peaks. So in this manner, so here basically you see leakage corresponding to bit 0, bit 1, bit 2, bit 3, and so on. So in this manner, the attacker can recover the entire message bit one bit at a time, thereby realizing a side channel based full decryption oracle. However, unlike the leakage of the PC oracle, leakage due to single message bits is more finer because it only exists for a very few clock cycles. And therefore, it is slightly more harder to exploit. And therefore, this particular attack is more sensitive to noise, but it is still we can still be able to recover the message nevertheless. So this type of recovery also applies to all the LW and LWR based schemes in the NIST-PQC process. So if you think about trying to protect against this attack, one simple countermeasure that you can think about is to simply shuffle the order of the decoding process and or try to do it in parallel. So at least if you try to decode the order of the decoding procedure, you can actually prevent the attacker from knowing the order of the bits. And at the surface level, it looks like a strong countermeasure, and it was also proposed in a couple of prior works as a strong countermeasure. But what we show in this work is that the attacker can actually exploit the ciphertext malleability property of lattice-based schemes to break the shuffling countermeasure. So here I'd like to give a bit of an idea of what is the ciphertext malleability property. So for a given ciphertext CT corresponding to a message M, an attacker can basically construct a perturbed ciphertext such that the bits of the message M are masked with an arbitrary mask of the attacker's choice. So in this work, what we basically show is that the ciphertext malleability property can be used to break protected implementation and its variants. So in this table, we basically summarize our findings where we show that different implementation variants of the encoding and decoding function can be targeted with different number of traces. So while some countermeasures seems to increase the attacker's effort, countermeasures are not foolproof and attacks still work. So in this work, we basically show that the ciphertext malleability property can be used as a tool for efficient side channel attacks. And this attack also applies in a generic manner to 6 lattice-based schemes in the NIST-PQC process. Now over to the third contribution. So in 2021, we actually presented an invited talk to NIST on side channel attacks on LW and LWR-based schemes. And one obvious question that came up was, are these attacks also possible on N-true-based schemes? Because if you remember, there are two categories of lattice-based schemes, one based on the learning with the error and rounding problem, and one based on the N-true problem. So the obvious question was whether similar attacks are possible on N-true-based schemes, and whether these attacks are easy or difficult to mount on N-true-based schemes compared to LW and LWR-based schemes. Because the reason being that the arithmetic of N-true-based schemes is vastly different from that of LW and LWR-based schemes. So, and at that time, there was no prior work in this direction. It was more of an open problem. So to answer this question, we basically presented the first side channel chosen ciphertext attacks on N-true-based schemes as well. And we did our attack on two candidates, N-true, which was a finalist candidate, and N-true prime, which is an alternate finalist candidate. So the main outcome of this work was that it requires approximately the same effort to break N-true-based schemes compared to LW and LWR-based schemes. And our attacks worked for all parameters of N2 and N2 prime with a 100% success rate. So here, this flowchart basically shows the different type of side channel ciphertext attacks, where our work basically leveled the playing field with similar attacks on N2-based schemes as well. So now we move on to the second part of our research contribution, which is fault injection attacks. So here, the main motivation of the attacker is to inject faults to create weak instances of the LWE problem or the N2 problem, or to try to reduce the entropy of the secrets or sensitive data. So the main question that one can ask is whether there exists a single point of failure for faults in lattice-based schemes. So we're trying to find an Achilles heel for lattice-based schemes. So through a couple of works, we show that algorithmic design choices as well as implementation choices can lead to single point of failures in lattice-based schemes, which can enable very efficient fault attacks. So this brings us to the first work, which is on nonce-reuse based fault attack on LW and LWR based schemes. So LW schemes typically involve generation of LW instances whose quality decides the security of the crypto system. Why? Because LW instances are basically used as part of public keys and ciphertext, and hence their quality is very important for security. So the LW instance is nothing but A times S plus E, where S is the secret and E is the error. And what's important to note is that the error component E is very vital, because without the error or with a weak error, the LW instance is considered to be compromised or broken. So what we did is we tried to analyze how the secrets and errors are being generated in several schemes. So the secrets and errors are typically long vectors or polynomials, which require a large amount of randomness to sample. And this randomness is particularly not cheap on embedded devices. So in order to sample S or E, which is the secret or error, a small truly random seed is taken and it's fed to a PRNG in order to create a large pool of randomness, which is then fed to a sampling algorithm. So here you're starting with a small seed, you feed it to a PRNG, you generate a large amount of pseudo randomness, which then is fed to a sampling algorithm. So ideally, you would expect that the schemes try to use different seeds for generating S and E. However, most of the LW and LWR based schemes that we examined decided to use the same seed, but with a different delimiter to sample S and E. So here you see that the seeds only differ by a single bit. So this can basically be seen as a fault vulnerability, because the attacker can try to inject faults to ensure that the same seed is reused to generate both S and E, and this ensures that the secret is basically equal to the error. And such an LW instance can be trivially broken through Gaussian elimination and can result in efficient key recovery and message recovery attacks. So our attacks are actually applicable to 4 lattice-based schemes, that's Kyber, Dilithium, Frodo, and New Hope. And it's important to note that this was the first practical fault attack on lattice-based schemes. And we validated the attack on open source implementations of these schemes in the PQM4 library using electromagnetic fault injection. And as you can see, there are some schemes like New Hope or Frodo, which are vulnerable to just a single fault. So this work was basically published during round 1 of the NIST PQC process, and this work basically had a very notable impact. So after we published the work, designers of Frodo Chem acknowledged the attack and did modifications to the algorithm to remove the single point of failure. So they simply used different seeds to sample both the secret and error. And this is again yet another practical instance where implementation attacks are having an effect on the algorithm design. While other schemes such as Kyber and New Hope also acknowledge the attack, they did not change the specifications in order to not lose out on efficiency, because countermeasures typically come with a certain cost. So this brings us to the final part of the talk, which is on performing practical fault injection attacks on the number theoretic transform. So polynomial multiplication is basically one of the most computationally intensive blocks in lattice-based schemes, and number theory transform is a critical kernel or subblock that's used to perform polynomial multiplication in several lattice-based schemes. So this number theory transform, when used for polynomial multiplication, operates over sensitive variables such as the secret key, and hence, therefore, serves as an attractive target for fault injection attacks. And during our research, we proposed the first and only practical fault attack on the number theory transform. And the fault attack basically exploited an implementation level vulnerability. And we were able to exploit that vulnerability to perform key recovery and message recovery attacks on KyberChem, which is a NIST PQC standard. And we were also able to demonstrate signature forgery attacks and verification bypass attacks on dilithium as well. So in order to understand how this attack works, we need to see how entity-based polynomial multiplication works. So let's say you want to multiply two polynomials A and S. So what you do is you basically transform both the operands to the entity domain, do a pointwise multiplication, and then you do an inverse entity to get the product. So the entity transform, if you look at how it works, it basically utilizes a lot of pre-computed constants, which are known as twiddle constants, twiddle factors. So if you look at implementation of the scheme on a microcontroller, the twiddle constants are typically stored as part of the flash memory as part of the firmware binary. So basically the twiddle constants are stored in the flash memory. So within the MCU, you have the twiddle constants stored at a certain address, which we denote as the base address. And the base address is also in turn stored in another location in the flash memory. So in order to access the twiddle constants, what the CPU does is the CPU first fetches the base address from flash, and then it computes the address of the other constants by simply adding offsets to this base address. So we identified that this is a single point of failure because an attacker can fault the base address when it is fetched from flash memory. So the attacker can fault the base address when it's fetched from flash memory. And if it is faulted to a different value, then you're essentially faulting all the twiddle constants at the same time. So in our experiments, we identified that you can inject a fault to point to a zeroized memory location with a very high probability, as most of the addressable memory is filled with zeros. So when the twiddle constants are zeroized, what happens? That's the next question. So when the twiddle constants are actually zeroized, the entity output basically has a very low entropy. Here you can basically see that only the first two elements are basically repeating throughout. So the entropy of the entity output is drastically reduced. And if you basically look at the inverse entity of this particular entity output, then it corresponds to a valid polynomial where only the first two elements are non-zero while all the elements are basically zero. So you can basically brute force this particular secret. And if S is a secret, then you have essentially reduced the entropy of the secret with a single fault. And in our practical experiments, we performed experimental validation using electromagnetic fault injection on open source implementations of Kyber and dilithium. And we were able to obtain 100% repeatability of faults to zeroize the twiddle constants using several fault injection parameters. So our fault on the entity is also able to bypass several known fault protections for Kyber and dilithium that were also known against prior attacks. And this particular attack, we did a survey of the existing open source implementations of Kyber and dilithium, and all the implementations were basically vulnerable to our fault attack on the number theoretic transform. So I'm going to finish up with the other contributions of the thesis. So we also proposed configurable shuffling and masking countermeasures for the number theoretic transform, because there were some works which also proposed side channel attacks on the number theoretic transform, which only require a single phase. And this particular paper received the Best Paper Award at SPACE 2019. And we also did a systematic study of the different side channel attacks and fault attacks on Kyber and dilithium, because throughout the NIST PQC standardization process, apart from us, there were also other research groups which were basically proposing different types of side channel and fault attacks. So we thought it would be really nice to do a systematic study of side channel attacks and fault attacks on Kyber and dilithium, which are the NIST PQC standards, and try to build a taxonomy of attacks and the corresponding countermeasures. So then subsequently, we also worked on several other works where we show that inherent algorithmic properties of lattice-based schemes can be used to build hardware trojans as well as cryptographic backdoors as well, which will also come under this umbrella of implementation attacks. So these are the research outcomes, which can be broadly classified into three categories. First is the physical attacks, where we have side channel attacks, fault attacks, and hardware trojans and backdoors. On the implementations front, we also worked on countermeasures as well as some optimizations for efficient implementations. And we've also done survey of different post-quantum cryptographic schemes and different side channel attacks and fault attacks as well. And some of the notable achievements of the PhD research was that one of the works received Best Paper Award at SPACE 2020. Sorry, there was a typo where I mentioned 2019. So it's PACE 2020. And the research also received Best PhD Forum Presentation Award at IEEE Asian Host 2020. And during the NIST PQC process, we were also invited to present 2 seminars to NIST, which is the PQC standardization body, on side channel attacks and fault attacks on post-quantum cryptography. And some of the attacks that we proposed also triggered change in the algorithmic specification of a few schemes. So we believe that our work has a lasting impact on the NIST PQC standards in a small way, And several of our research works were also cited in NIST status reports of the PQC standardization process. So now I will basically conclude with conclusion and future works. So to conclude, what our research has shown is that easy side channel attacks and fault attacks are possible on unprotected post-quantum lattice-based cryptographic schemes. And lattice-based schemes have a lot of underlying algorithmic features that can be exploited to perform very efficient side channel attacks and fault attacks. So it is actually paramount or very important to deploy lattice-based implementations that are protected with suitable and strong algorithmic or implementation level countermeasures. And I would also like to invite the viewers to basically have a look at our survey where we did a systematic attack on different side channel attacks and fault attacks on Kyber and Dilithium, which are the NIST PQC standards. And existing countermeasures are actually very expensive as they incur 2 to 3 times higher runtime. So it's also a good opportunity to actually work on building efficient countermeasures for lattice-based schemes. So some of the open questions that we can think about is that we saw that through our side channel LSTH-owned ciphertext attacks, the effort transform was basically very leaky, leading to very efficient side channel attacks. So there are some current research that's going on to think about alternatives to effort transform to achieve CCA security. The current schemes are not very efficient or they are slightly more bulky. So coming up with efficient non-effort transform CCA secure schemes is something that's very interesting. Then thinking about dedicated leakage detection frameworks to detect side channel attacks and fault attacks is also interesting from a certification perspective, where if you want to design a PQC product, you want to go through certification, and the certification lab wants to basically run a set of tests to check whether the PQC implementation is secure or not. So for which leakage detection frameworks will be very, very useful. And also doing research on combined low-cost countermeasures that can protect against both side channel attacks and fault attacks is also a very interesting research topic. So finally, just to conclude, I'd like to thank a few people here. So firstly, the Thesis Advisory Committee, which consists of Prof. Arvind Ishwaran and Dr. Kukuming from DSO. And I'd also like to thank all my research collaborators who basically accompanied me in this PhD journey. I'd also like to specially thank the authors of the PQM4 library, which is an open source benchmarking and testing framework for post-quantum cryptographic schemes, because the PQM4 library made PQC implementations very accessible to researchers like us, and it enabled very easy portability to different platforms in order to try out our research work. So thanks to the authors of the PQM4 library, and thanks to all the anonymous people who answer queries on Stack Overflow, because we get stuck multiple times during our research and we always look for answers. So thank you very much. And I also like to specially thank a few people here. Firstly, my supervisors, Dr. Anupam Chattopadhyay and Dr. Shivam Basan. My thesis wouldn't have been half of what it is without your valuable inputs and your time. And thank you for being very kind and patient, because during the initial part of the PhD process, things were not really going as fast as how we expected. But you were kind enough, you were patient enough to persist with me, and thank you very much for that. And I also would like to thank Dr. Sujoy Sinha Roy. So Sujoy Sinha Roy basically visited NTU in 2019, and that was the moment when my PhD research basically kind of took off. So I'd like to really thank Sujoy for all the insightful discussions and all the works that we've done together. And finally, I'd also like to thank my wife, Shenbaga, and my daughter, Nila. So basically, so it's a bit of a sorry and a thank you, because she was never really meant to be part of this, so I dragged her in. PhD is a very tough journey. There were a lot of very dark moments, a lot of slightly happy moments. So thanks for really persisting with me. And I also like to thank GVM, who is like a favorite filmmaker of mine, who taught me different, like, who gave me perspectives of what life is and so on. Yeah. So at this moment, I'd like to thank everyone who have also attended this PhD presentation and waiting patiently to listen to my talk. So thank you very much. So I'd like to conclude here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Prasanna, for the very good presentation. And now let's open the floor and see any questions. Maybe you can start with the audience, students who have any questions.
There is a question from the audience in the chat box from Shanti.
Okay, sorry. Maybe I'll take the question. So. Okay, so I just like to read the question. So due to your research, it said that by zeroizing some bits in the secret key, it can lead to increasing the possibility of brute force attacks. Please correct me if I'm wrong. If this is true, do you have any idea regarding the threshold of this attack to maintain the security of the target algorithm? Okay, so firstly, just to give a bit of a clarification. So here we are not directly zeroizing the secret key. So what we are doing is we are indirectly zeroizing the some pre-computed constants that are actually used to perform polynomial multiplication. So we are not really directly zeroizing the secret key because apparently the architecture of the microcontroller basically ensures that you can fault the pre-computed constants more easily than the variables that reside deeper in memory such as RAM, which is more closer to the chip. So the flash memory is typically away from the main core. So the data transfer between the flash memory and the CPU is what is more susceptible to fault, and we can actually fault that. So the question that he has asked is do you have any idea regarding the threshold of this attack to maintain the security of the target algorithm? So I think he's talking about countermeasures against this attack. So because it's an implementation level attack, you need to come up with implementation level countermeasures to protect the entity block. So the main problem or the main vulnerability that was exploited in this attack was the fact that the same base address is used to compute all the twiddle constant addresses. So this is a single point of failure. So you can try to remove the single point of failure by incorporating either redundancy or using some other implementation techniques to access the twiddle constant. So in that way, you can actually protect against this attack. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe let me read. How did you change the base address of flash memory of the twiddle constant?
Yes. So maybe I'd like to go back to my presentation. So yeah, so the idea is that whenever the entity computation is done by the CPU, first the entity constants needs to the twiddle constants needs to be accessed, but the CPU does not know where the twiddle constants where the twiddle array is basically in the flash memory. So first it basically recovers the twiddle address, which is the base address of the array, and this data transfer between the flash memory and the CPU is how we are actually trying to what we're trying to fault. And this fault was basically injected using electromagnetic fault injection. And okay, the question is, how do I know exactly where to fault? So what an attacker can do is the attacker can get a similar device, can port the implementation, and can basically run the implementation multiple times and can profile the device by trying to inject faults at different locations. And during profiling, the attacker can basically try to observe the output and see which location basically corresponds to a good fault. And with profiling, the attacker can basically identify how to find the exact parameters to fault. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah, I think there's another question. So from Matthias. So is there anything that you wished open source libraries like PKM4 could have done better to support your research? Additionally, is there anything you wished NIST would have done to support research on SE and FIA? Okay, I think it's a really good question. So firstly, Matthias is I think one of the co-authors of the PKM4 library. So first of all, I'd like to thank Matthias for the PKM4 library. And I think PKM4 library was more meant for benchmarking and testing rather than side channel attack research or fault injection attack research. So I would say that porting. So in order to do side channel attacks and fault attacks, we'll have to first modify the implementation a little bit, and then basically make changes such that you can communicate with the device freely and you can probe the device with different inputs and so on. So you have to basically create a communication wrapper, and also you have to create triggers at the operations that you want to target. So maybe these small changes could have helped, but it didn't really hinder research so much. PKM4 library was already pretty good, but it'll definitely be interesting to maybe create a fork of the PKM4 library where we make it, let's say, more conducive for side channel attack and fault attack research. And with respect to what NIST could have done to support research on side channel attacks and fault attacks, I'm sorry, I currently don't have answer to this question. But yeah, I think maybe when we discuss offline, I'll probably have some more time to think about it. Yeah.
There is a question from Martinez. He raised his hand.
Oh. Okay. Thank you. It's very interesting talk. Very interesting summary.
Thanks, Martin.
Congratulations on the journey.
Thank you.
And thank you to you and Shivam for teaching me a lot about this side channel attack. Because as a mathematician, I never cared that much before I start interacting with you two. Okay, so I have one technical questions and another one more of a request for reference.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look into this number theoretic transform, right?
Yeah.
How general is this fault injection attack? The context of my questions is, of course, for many of these lattice-based, we can define the quotient ring accordingly, right? Like in n-through or n-through prime, the polynomial that we use to define the quotient polynomial ring, therefore the polynomial that govern all of the multiplication rules, so to speak, we can modify. Even for Kyber, different parameter set we can define, and the polynomial will adjust accordingly. So it looks to me that this FIA is pretty general. So is my understanding correct? And the follow up to that question, if it is correct, is there a difference in terms of the complexity? For example, n-through or n-through prime. N-through prime, to be specific, has a simpler polynomial compared to others, and therefore the NTT is it can be faster to implement than others. Yeah. So in summary, is this a general attack on any defined quotient polynomial ring? The second, if yes, then are there differences in terms of the complexity? Thank you. Prasanna, you're still mute, I think.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So in Singapore, there's always planes flying by, so I think there's another plane, so that's why I muted. So
Okay.
yeah, so maybe I'll go back to the slides. So first of all, thank you very much for the question. So here, what you have here is you have an input which has a lot of entropy, and once you inject the fault, you basically have the first two elements repeated all over. And this particular instance is only applicable for Kyber because Kyber uses what is called an incomplete entity, where it doesn't compute all the layers of the entity. It only computes n-1 layers of the entity. So that's why you have this change where two elements are actually repeating all over. But if you look at dilithium, for instance, dilithium computes a complete entity. And in that case, what happens is the entropy of this is reduced further, wherein the first element is repeated all over. So to answer your question, different entities basically are done differently. And depending on how they are done for that particular polynomial ring, the final entropy of the output basically differs based on that. So if you zeroize the trivial constants, the entropy is definitely going to reduce, but by how much it's going to reduce depends on the polynomial ring and the type of scheme that you're dealing with. So to answer your first question, it is a generic attack. I believe it's a generic attack, and it applies differently to different schemes based on how the entity is computed for that particular polynomial ring. Okay.
The second one, just a reference. You mentioned that the German standard body listed the McAleese as one of the chosen.
Yes.
I'm just curious, why is that so? I mean, we know that the key is super big, and do they mention it for special usage or for general usage?
Yeah. So so basically, if I understand correctly, BSI recommended usage of FrodoChem and classic McAleese, which are both the most conservative post-quantum cryptographic schemes in terms of security in the respective categories. So
yes.
If you look at code-based schemes, classic McAleese is the most conservative.
Yeah.
And if you look at lattice-based schemes, FrodoChem is the most conservative. So this is a recommendation from BSI. But what it also stated is that it is also following the NIST-PQC process. And as the NIST-PQC process matures, and they will also probably add the NIST-PQC standards as recommendations as well. But at the current moment, they have not. They've only endorsed FrodoChem and classic McAleese. But hopefully in the future, for interoperability purposes, they will also potentially include the NIST-PQC standards as well. Yeah. But BSI is not conducting a competition on its own. So it's just basically following what NIST is doing. And also there are some other PQC standardization processes happening. There's one happening right now in Korea. There's one already that's concluded in China. So I guess BSI is more looking more at the NIST PQC process, and hopefully it will also basically take inputs from NIST as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions.
Okay, any questions from the panels? Suki?
Yeah, maybe I just have a couple of, I guess, high-level questions. So just to clarify, your experiments were actually done on the ARM Cortex-M4, right? All of them.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So how would your attacks or even the countermeasures be applicable to different type of implementation platforms? I mean, including like hardware accelerators for PQC and so on.
Yeah. So I think I can explain that by going to the overview slide. Yeah. So basically, if you look at the side channel attack that we did on chems, these attacks primarily try to exploit the algorithmic properties of LW and LWR, the algorithmic properties of lattice-based chems, and we believe that it can be ported to both hardware and software, because at no point when we are trying to construct the attack, when we try to basically adapt it to certain implementation. So obviously a little bit of adapting would be required, because some platforms inherently are more noisy. So if you look at, let's say, Raspberry Pi, for instance, which has a more complex processor, a deeper pipeline, there are much more operations that are happening in parallel. So the side channel measurements traces themselves have, like, the noise and the side channel measurements are different for different platforms, but the methodology of how you're constructing the chosen ciphertexts and what type of leakage that you're trying to exploit, that doesn't really change. So it stays the same for a particular scheme, irrespective of whether it's implemented, let's say, on an ARM Cortex M4 processor or an ARM Cortex A processor. But the success rate of the attack depends on the available noise and the available signal in the measurements. So some platforms are inherently more noisy, some are inherently less noisy, so the success rates will differ. And as I mentioned in the talk, the first attack, which is the binary plaintext taking oracle attack, is more robust to noise because you are essentially trying to do binary classification by exploiting leakage from few thousand leakage points. So it's very easy to exploit. And similarly, our third part, which is the generic attacks on entry-based chems, those attacks are also generic towards different implementation platforms because there again we have a few hundred to few thousand leakage points which we can exploit. But if you look at the second attack, which is a full decryption oracle attack, here you're trying to recover multiple bits of information in a single trace. So because you're trying to recover more information, you require more signal in the measurements. So this attack, I would say, is more susceptible to noise. And if you try to do it on a more complex hardware, the success rate will definitely be impacted much more than the binary plaintext taking oracle attack or the generic attacks that we did on entry-based chems. So essentially, it depends on the type of attack that you are trying to do, basically. Yeah. But okay, I think I haven't talked about the fault attacks. So the fault attacks are more implementation dependent because it depends on what type of processor it is, because there are some processors that are susceptible to certain types of faults and some that are not. So if you look at the nonce reuse attack, for instance, you are essentially looking at bit flips and so on. So those attacks would essentially be more applicable towards hardware, but they can also be done on software as well. And if you look at the entity attack, for instance, here we are relying on a very specific fault model where we are looking at data transfer from flash memory to the CPU, change of the base address, and so on and so forth. So this particular attack is more applicable to software rather than hardware. So I would say this attack cannot really be adapted to, let's say, hardware accelerators, or would require significant amount of re-engineering effort to do that. But I would say side channel attacks, the side channel attacks that we have presented are operating more on the algorithmic level. So they are relatively more implementation agnostic, but the fault attacks are trying to exploit specific implementation weaknesses, which depend on the type of platform and the type of design that you're basically doing.
Okay. So I know that in one of your future work, you are trying to propose something that we can combine both the countermeasures for the side channel attacks and the fault attacks. But in your current work, have you studied the impact of these countermeasures? I mean, does one countermeasure affect the other the other type of attacks, for example?
Yes. So I was referring to this systematic study of different side channel and fault attacks, where we were trying to build a taxonomy of different attacks on Kyber and dilithium. And in that work, we also proposed a few algorithmic countermeasures, which I haven't covered in this talk. But just to give you a bit of an idea, on the fault attack domain, there are a few fault attacks which operate in the chosen ciphertext setting. So the idea is our attacks are side channel. So the side channel attacks that we presented query the target device with chosen inputs, and it exploits the side channel leakage to recover the secret key. Similarly, there are also fault attacks where you query with chosen inputs and you inject faults to recover information about the secret key. So in a chosen ciphertext setting, you can do both side channel attacks and fault attacks. And for the chosen ciphertext setting, we propose some countermeasures that apply to both side channel and fault attacks together. So again, it depends on the. So there are some countermeasures that can apply to both side channel and fault attacks, and some are very specific to the implementation or the attack that you're looking at. So there is some synergy between side channel attacks and fault attacks for few countermeasures and for some not. I don't think it's a very clear answer, but I think we should still go approach it on a case by case basis. I guess I don't think there's like a one solution that fits all attacks. I think so.
Okay. I think maybe my last question would be, you did mention that the existing countermeasures leads to like 2 to 3 times of the overhead, right? Something like that. But well, I mean, I missed this, but what's the overhead of the countermeasures that you have proposed?
Yeah. So so the countermeasures that I was talking about is called the masking countermeasure, where the idea is you try to split the secret into multiple shares and you try to operate over the individual shares of the secret independently. So you don't try to mix the secret, so that you're trying to randomize the way you're splitting the secret every time. And this is a randomization countermeasure that's very generic. And this particular masking countermeasure is actually the one that's the most expensive, which incurs a 2 to 3 times overhead in runtime. But masking countermeasure again is not like a single countermeasure that prevents all side channel attacks, because there are also works that have shown that masking schemes can be designed in a flawed manner. There can be flaws in masking schemes, and um, and perfectly masked implementations are also vulnerable to attacks. So in the survey that we did, we also basically stressed the fact that apart from masking, you also need dedicated countermeasures against individual attacks, because masking alone cannot protect against all attacks. So so in our work, we actually worked on 2 countermeasures, or 2 works dealing with countermeasures. And one work was trying to protect the entity against single trace attack. And when you look at entity, for instance, you're just trying to protect that particular block against the single trace attack. So there the overhead was again roughly about 70 to 80%, depending on the type of countermeasure you want to deploy. And if you want to protect against specific attacks, then the overheads can be lower. So I think if you want to approach a protected implementation of lattice-based scheme, you need to combine both generic countermeasures as well as specific countermeasures. So I think the overheads will be slightly more, I would say. Yeah, I hope it answered your question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thanks, Ravi. I don't have any more questions.
Yeah.
Jipong, do you have any questions?
Yes. First, I would like to congratulate the team for doing a very impressive. In fact, I want to commend Ravi for this very clear presentation, and also I want to say that this is probably one of the best, or in fact, the very best presentation for PhD order I ever get in this field of security related. So I think it's very impressive. Thanks a lot for this presentation.
Thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions. From your presentation, I can see actually that you are basically exploiting not just the 2 parts, because first is the side channel and fault injection are basically hardware based. It's related to implementation vulnerability, but you're actually combining this with the other aspect, which is more related to the crypto algorithm itself, that is the chosen ciphertext. So if I were to separate the 2, it means that what you are seeing is actually not simply because taking away one of them, it won't be successful. So it means that it's not just the implementation, although that may be the nominal part weaknesses, but it also boils down to the algorithmic weaknesses or the crypto weaknesses from the chosen ciphertext aspect. So it seems that a good countermeasure should not only come from just the implementation, but also must come partially addressing those weaknesses at the front end, which is also from the crypto perspective. Am I right to say that?
Yes, exactly. I think that's a really good point that you made there. That lattice-based schemes, the reason why they were selected as NSPQC standards is because they really have nice security properties, a good confidence in their security, as well as they are efficient to implement on practical platforms when you compare it with other post-quantum cryptographic schemes.
Yeah.
But the problem is that this efficiency basically comes at the cost of some security. So this efficiency basically comes from some linear properties that exist in lattice-based schemes. So I would say lattice-based schemes, they do contain non-linear operations, but there are several operations that are linear, and these linearity properties, which result in efficiency for performance, also helps an attacker to perform side channel attacks and fault attacks, especially chosen ciphertext attacks. So the ability to control the decryption, the ability to control the decrypted message for chosen inputs basically comes from the fact that the decryption process is very linear. Most of the decryption process is linear.
Yeah.
So there is much more controllability of the intermediate state. But if you compare this with RSA or ECC, such attacks are not very prominent or not known. But lattice-based schemes seem to be much more vulnerable in that aspect. So I would say that if you're thinking about countermeasures, definitely you need to think about how to protect it at the algorithmic level. And that's why we are seeing a lot of research on trying to develop leakage resilient algorithms in itself, where the algorithm itself is basically resilient to side channel leakage. So you were spot on there when you mentioned that we need to protect schemes both at the algorithmic level as well as the implementation level. That's true.
Yeah. Second thing I can see from your part 1, part 2 for the first part, there are two factors from the attacker efficiency perspective, because after all, it's not just the defender has the efficiency issue, the attacker do have that as well. There are two metrics. One is the number of query, which is number of chosen ciphertext.
Yes.
Second one is the number of traces. What is the relation between these two in part 1 and in part 2?
Yeah. So so part 1 is where you're referring to side channel attacks, and part 2 is the fault attacks, right?
No, I'm referring to the same side channel attack in binaries, PC Oracle, and full decryption. So I
Yes.
suppose part 1 you need a lot of queries, and that has a cost. And in fact, you probably will not gain successful attack if there is a query control.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So I think I'll just go back to my slides. Yeah, so the basic fact is that if you look at the binary plain text checking oracle, here you are trying to restrict the message to two possibilities, and an attacker is trying to recover whether the message is a 0 or a 1 for chosen ciphertext. And here you're only recovering 1 bit of information per query, and the secret is typically a few thousand bits. So you require a few thousand queries to basically recover the secret key. But in the full decryption oracle attack, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a message or chosen ciphertext for which the corresponding message has 256 bits of information about the secret key. So it has a lot more information about the secret key. And if the attacker is able to recover the entire decrypted message in a single trace, then it reduces the total number of traces or the total number of chosen ciphertexts to perform full key recovery. So I would say in this context, the number of chosen ciphertexts equals to the number of traces, because for every chosen ciphertext query, you are basically having one side channel trace. So the improvement basically comes from the fact that if you are able to exploit more leakage in a single trace, you can reduce the number of traces. So there is like a trade-off going on between the amount of information you can extract in a trace versus the number of traces that you require to recover the full key, basically.
So obviously then I can see that for the first one, you require 1,000 over query. That is probably easier to defend against because I mean, it also alert somebody when you continuously collecting, making so much query.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is also a really good point, that one of the countermeasures that we can implement, not at the primitive level, but more at the protocol level, is that when you're observing a lot of decapsulation failures, because chosen ciphertexts always result in decapsulation failures. So if you observe a lot of decapsulation failures at the protocol level, then you can try to refresh your secret key. So this is one protocol level countermeasure that one can actually think about. And that's why what is interesting as a further research direction is, can you do chosen ciphertext attacks with valid ciphertexts? Because when you are trying to do attacks with valid ciphertext, then you're not really triggering a lot of failures. And this is much more stealthier compared to the chosen ciphertext attack where you are querying with bad ciphertexts.
Okay. Okay, so you're also assuming this is under a static environment where the session key doesn't change a lot, right?
Yes, the long-term secret key doesn't change, and the same long-term secret key is valid for multiple session. Like it's used to generate multiple session keys.
Okay,
yes.
Fine, thanks. So for second one, so once you reduce the number of query and then you actually push a lot actually to the side channel decisions in some way. So then will the I mean there's a lot of the trend of the side channel attack today actually move towards the ML. The advantage being that as machine learning assisted side channel. So how does this, will this also help?
Yes, definitely. So I would say that machine learning based side channel attacks are really good when it comes to jitter in the side channel traces. So when the side channel traces have a lot of misalignment, which is typically the case when you're trying to do attacks on more complex devices, machine learning is really good in observing patterns or detecting patterns. Because if you have an image and if you have the cat, which is like this, like this, like this, it can still detect. So the same intuition also applies in a side channel setting as well. So I would say machine learning attacks can deal with more noise. And also when you want to do attacks on masked implementations, where the secret key is basically shared across multiple domains, there also machine learning attacks can actually be very helpful. And there are a few machine learning based side channel attacks on lattice based schemes, which have tried to basically uh, 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 break mask implementations. So there's also already some work in that direction. Yes.
Yeah. Last couple of questions. First, I just before I forget, if you might just send me your slide and also if there's a recorded video on this. Okay, that related to a couple of things I'm probably interested. Because we are also trying to do some NTT accelerations, but we are looking at the SOC level, okay? And because NTT has been not just used in post-quantum, but also in some fully homomorphic encryption and so on. So one aspect, I think Siu Kai have earlier mentioned, in fact, I was also thinking that because when people trying to accelerate NTT is very different from when you are doing the instruction based or making use of the ARM core. I understand that the Cherries memory probably Cherries the weight memory normally they don't really play to touch too much, but there is also this access when they're trying to prioritize. There's an access conflict in the butterfly and so on. So they won't actually do the computation as in the normal this memory access as in instruction set based kind of computation. So that might actually in some way have a certain distributive effect, not really directly for a defense, but for the nature of they want to prioritize and minimize the data access dependency. So, but that indirectly also making your fault injection attack quite difficult. So to some extent, I believe SOC or ASIC based kind of implementation can be quite challenging for your injection fault injection attack. What's your opinion on this?
Yes, definitely. So I totally agree on that, because the entity fault attack that we did was specific to the to low-end microcontrollers where you basically have a lot of data transfer happening between the flash memory, where the flash memory is basically embedded as part of the chip. There's a lot of data transfer going on, and the operation is more sequential. So definitely the fault attack on the entity is more applicable on those devices, but we haven't really studied the applicability of this fault attack on more complex devices, or let's say even on hardware implementations. But maybe the twiddle constants probably don't serve as a good target, but rather you can maybe try to change the control flow of the entity and do something there. But
Yeah.
It'll be a good thing to study actually, how you can target entity on more complex SoCs.
Sure, sure. Anyway, the reason in this perspective, when we came across something related to your expertise in fault attack and side channel, maybe there's some point in time I would like to consult you on if we really move towards that
Sure.
angle. So
Sure,
the
sure.
other thing is just a final one. It looks to me that if you distribute because most of the attack suffer a lot from the memory, because memory is an entity that typically you can more accurately apply certain fault injection or even leak information. So what is your view on distributed memory in implementing PQC?
Again, I would definitely say that it does have a disruptive effect when it comes to fault injection attack, because here we are actually attacking a more monolithic memory where like there's only one single memory. So if you have a distributed memory, obviously you need multiple fault injection probes, you need synchronization between the different faults, and a lot of things, which definitely increases the attacker's complexity to perform the attack. But again, how hard it becomes totally comes down to the type of device you're dealing with. So I would definitely say that it has a disruptive effect on the attack, but but what's the extent of the protection that's provided in case of distributed memory is something that needs to be studied. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks. I think with that, I don't have much question. I
Thank you
hope
very
you can
much.
share the slide and the video with me. Thanks a lot.
Sure. Thank you very much for the patience. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Any further questions for Ravi? Okay, all right. I think we have enough questions so far. I think given the time limit, so I think let's end the presentation and the Q&A session. Can Ravi and other students of the audience leave the meeting room? I think we need to discuss with supervisors and the panels about the Ravi's case. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Prasanna, you may
thanks,
have to
Ravi.
delegate someone as the organizer. I don't know if the Teams meeting will just vanish if you leave.
Okay, sir. Maybe I'll just try to see.